So the big news story with the whole Trump-Harris presidential debate, the big news story is that there was like a whole lot of bias in the moderating team from ABC, but I think it's actually a lot way worse than people realize. Not only did the moderators like attempt to fact check Trump throughout the night, I think there's like what, 4 or 5 times. And by the way, they fact checked Harris a total of 0 times, but perhaps in the easiest, like most obvious, most morally significant instance in which they could have fact checked Harris, they didn't. Let's first look at some of the examples of them attempting to fact check Trump, and we're actually going to talk about this first one a little bit later on in the video.
Great service in doing it. It took courage to do it. And the Supreme Court had great courage in doing it. And I give tremendous credit to those 6 justices.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born. Madam Vice.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that a little bit later on. In this next clip, they're talking about election fraud.
And you know this, you and your allies, 60 cases in front of many judges, many of them Republican.
No judge looked at it
and said
they said we didn't have standing. That's the other thing.
All right, this next clip is now the infamous city manager of Springfield who says that there's no credible reports of pets being harmed.
Did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just...
Oh man, why is this even being discussed?
Nobody thought possible.
President Trump, as you know, the FBI says overall violent crime is actually coming down in this country. But
excuse me, the FBI they were defrauding statements. They didn't include the worst cities.
It's just so weird. Like, why are they trying to fact check Trump, but then didn't do anything to Harris? It's just really bizarre. So those were the 4 examples. I mean, obviously they came very prepared with information. They thought they knew what Trump was going to say, and so they had their like sort of prepared remarks that they were going to sort of fire back at him. And they could have done this with Harris. Like, it's very like, let's look at these 5 different clips in which they could have actually done this to Harris. And this one is actually really nice because there's evidence after each clip that we see from Harris making a claim, with evidence actually contradicting what she said in the debate.
Tim Walz and I are both gun owners. We're not taking anybody's guns away, so stop with the continuous lying about this stuff.
We have to have a buyback program, and I support a mandatory buyback program. It's got to be smart. We got to do it the right way.
Do you believe in the mandatory buyback of quote-unquote assault weapons?
I do believe that we need to do buyback. Let's remember Charlottesville, where there was a mob of people carrying tiki torches, spewing anti-Semitic hate. And what did the president then at the time say? There were fine people on each side.
And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, and you had people, and I'm not talking about...
Yeah, here's the clarification that just, why do people not include this?
And I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the Supreme Court...
Like, very, very obviously, clearly, I mean, they could have fact-checked her on this.
The Supreme Court had great courage in doing it, and I give tremendous credit to those 6 justices.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born. Madam Vice President, I want to get your response to President Trump.
Okay, so that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So just keep that in mind. We're going to look at the actual reporting, the actual evidence here.
She was big on defund the police. In Minnesota,
And then also, again, what we need to do about demilitarizing our schools and taking police officers out of schools.
On that point, Donald Trump, the candidate, has said in this election there will be a bloodbath if this and the outcome of this election is not to his liking.
Mexico has taken, over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it, went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. Now, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line. and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
So why are the ABC moderators like actually trying to fact check? I think think about it for just a second. Like, why are they trying to do this? And I think like at least what's implied here is that they care about truth. They're trying to get at the truth. Like if Trump says something wrong, they want to fact check it. But I think there's actually something sort of else going on here. Like if it really was just about truth for them, don't you think they would have been fact checking Harris? Like there's some ulterior motive. The thing about truth is that you got to care about all of the truth, not just like what truth happens to be convenient for you. But it's way, way, way worse than a sort of like inconsistency and whether or not someone is trying to fact check or seek the truth. It's way worse than that, because there was a point during the debate, which I don't think people are really catching on to, where Trump was like asking them, hey, like ask her about this, ask her about late term abortions, like get her opinion on this. And they just failed to do it. And it's the stuff we're about to look at it was actually causing me a lot of distress today. That's one of the reasons why I'm recording this so late. But hopefully it doesn't upset you guys too much as we go through this. But let's watch this clip from the debate.
You should ask, will she allow abortion?
See, he's asking the moderators, like, hey, like, ask her. You've been asking me all these questions. You've been interrupting me. You've been trying to fact check me. Like, ask her a question that, like, would put her in an uncomfortable spot. Like, do it once.
Abortion in the 8th month, 9th month, 7th month.
Come on.
Okay, would you do that?
And she's acting like come on. Oh, man. What we're about to look at is it's horrible stuff.
Why don't you ask her that question?
Why don't you answer the question? Would you
because
veto?
Under Roe v. Wade,
answer the question. Would you veto?
You could do abortions in the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th
That's
month.
not true.
So he says in Roe v. Wade, you can do abortions in the 7th month, the 8th month, and the 9th month, which is just the third trimester. And she says, that's not true. Oh my goodness. This was a perfect opportunity for them to fact check, because according to Roe v. Wade, states were like obvious, like this is not controversial at all. They were allowed to prohibit abortions except when necessary to preserve the life or health of the mother. But then in Doe versus Bolton, in that decision, which was a companion case to Roe, it defined the health of the mother so broadly that it could include the physical, but the also emotional, the psychological, the familial, and age-related factors. So what this meant in practicality is that third trimester abortions could be permitted if a doctor deemed it necessary for the mother's well-being, even if the reasoning went way beyond like immediate physical health for the mother. But it's nevertheless like 100% uncontroversially true that Roe v. Wade allowed third trimester abortions. But like, where's the fact check? Like, what? Like they could have cut her off and been like, hey, no, it's true that Roe v. Wade actually did allow for third trimester abortions. And then obviously like Doe versus Bolton like made things a whole lot worse. But yeah, like where were they? Did the moderators not know the facts about this case? They seemed pretty well prepared when it came to comments that Trump was making. But let's continue the clip here.
Probably after birth. Just look at the former governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia said, we put the baby aside and then we determine what we want to do with the baby.
President Trump, thank you.
Okay, so if you haven't seen this clip that Trump is referring to, we're going to watch it. It's really bad stuff. And I'm sad that I have to show it and we have to talk about this, but let's do it.
There was a very contentious committee hearing yesterday when Fairfax County Delegate Kathy Tran made her case for lifting restrictions on third trimester abortions, as well as other restrictions now in place. And she was pressed by a Republican delegate about whether her bill would permit an abortion even as a woman is essentially dilating, ready to give birth. And she answered that it would permit an abortion at that stage of labor. Do you support her measure and explain her answer?
Yeah, and I wasn't there, Julie, and I certainly can't speak for Delegate Tran, but I would tell you first thing I would say is this is why decisions such as this should be made by providers, physicians, and the mothers and fathers that are involved. there are, when we talk about third trimester abortions, these are done with the consent of obviously the mother, with the consent of the physicians, more than one physician, by the way. And it's done in cases where there may be severe deformities, there may be a fetus that's non-viable. So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. So I think this was really blown out of proportion. But again, we want the government not to be involved in these types of decisions.
Yeah, so that's the clip. Not much to say about it. It's horrible stuff. But like, getting back to this debate, like, even if they didn't want to fact check Harris, they could have at least let her clarify her position. Like, they could have just said, well, what is your view on third trimester abortions? Like, what is it? And let her speak. I think we all know why they didn't do that. It would have actually like caused her to flesh out some of her views. And some of those views are probably not going to be too popular with people. Third trimester abortions, I mean, abortion in general is wrong, but third trimester abortions, like, a lot of people have issues with that. And they didn't want to allow her to clarify her view there. But you know what? Let's actually look at Kamala. Since they didn't ask this question, let's actually look for ourselves at Kamala's voting history. Let's look especially with respect to the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. She voted against this twice, once in 2019 and then once in 2020. She voted against, okay, so this bill would criminalize infanticide and clarify the standard of care that must be given to babies born alive after failed abortions. She voted against it twice. Again, this is not good or fun stuff to talk about, but I think we need to. So according to the Daily Signal, under Governor Tim Walz, babies born alive in botched abortions were left to die. Then he removed reporting requirements. As Democrats and media outlets accuse former President Donald Trump of dramatizing the Democratic abortion agenda, data from the Minnesota Department of Health shows that at least 8 babies who survived abortions in the state were left to die. Under a 2015 Minnesota law, the state formally was required to report whether abortions resulted in the live birth of a baby, what actions were taken to preserve the life of that baby, and whether the baby survived. Those reporting requirements exposed that between January 1st, 2021, and December 31st, 2021, physicians performed 5 abortions that resulted in a baby's live birth. So let's look at this post now from Roger Severino. I think that's how to say it. He says, Trump was 100% correct. Post-birth abortion is real, and Harris-Walz support it. At least 5 babies were born alive after botched abortions and left to die under Walz's watch. 2 of the, and this is just in 1 year, okay? Remember, the reporting for this is 1 year. 2 of these struggling babies were given comfort care instead of medical care, allegedly in violation of state law. How did Walz respond? By repealing the very law exposing and outlawing this horror and replacing it with abortion on demand on the front end and infanticide on the back end. Here are the bone-chilling receipts. Okay, so this is the actual, let's look at the PDF. And this one, let me scroll up first. So this one is the Minnesota Department of Health induced abortions in Minnesota, January through December of 2021. Okay, so after birth abortions are discussed on page 29. Let me skip down. Born Alive Infants Protection Act. The relevant section here is for the calendar year of January 1 through 2021 through December 31st, 2021. 5 abortion procedures resulting in a born alive infant were reported. So 5 procedures. In one instance, fetal anomalies were reported resulting in death shortly after delivery. No measures were taken to preserve the life. In 2 instances, comfort care measures were provided as planned and the infant did not survive. So there's no more details on whether or not, like, you can't say that this one was the result of some sort of defect or deformity or abnormality. Like, there's no information here. In the last one, in 2 instances, the infant was pre-viable, which means that they were not viable yet. and so no measures taken to preserve life were reported and the infant did not survive. What this means is that at least in the other two instances, they were not pre-viable, so they were viable. Yet, they were given comfort care and then allowed to die in Minnesota. Okay, so what is the point of all of this and talking about this? And well, bias is bad. Bias is very bad. We need to expose the truth on all sides. You know what? I wouldn't even have that much of a problem with them trying to fact check if they just would have done it consistently, or at least they would have shown their cards, at least said, hey, look, we're in support of Harris. That's why we're doing this. When I see a Christian moderator who sort of jumps in and wants to, defend the Christian debater and stuff that on occasion is not too concerning, because we know, we know that person is a Christian, and we know that they themselves have an agenda, and they're very open and honest about that. But when you want to come off as this impartial party who's just trying to deliver the facts and trying to get to the truth and stuff, you've got to be just obviously more impartial. But if this last section of the video that we just went over sort of made your blood boil, it made mine. And I don't really get too upset very often, but this stuff is horrible. It's bad. But in the next section, I think it's going to actually lift you up. So it's going to lift your spirits. I want to encourage you to continue watching, because this interview with Father Cajetan Cuddy on bias, the role of bias, the nature of bias, how we can overcome bias, it's so good. I want you guys to listen to this full interview. Father Cuddy is just awesome to listen to. His voice is so buttery and it's so good, but he also just has such good things to say. So I want you guys, if the last part of the video was hard to get through, I want you to just enjoy this next section. I think you guys are really going to get a lot out of this. All right, Father Cuddy. So people often say that bias is something that we should avoid, but what's so fundamentally wrong with being biased?
So bias, if by that we mean that we come to a discussion or a question or a dispute or a debate with preconceived notions, preconceived conclusions, then it compromises the very purpose of a debate or a discussion, which is to arrive at truth. So rather than moving towards truth, to a valid, true conclusion, bias says before the discussion, the debate even occurs, I already know what I hope we arrive at, and that defeats the very purpose of having a discussion. Now, if by bias we mean that after the discussion or the debate or the deliberation, in light of what we've discussed, in light of sound reasoning and reflection, I have convictions that I believe are true, then that's different. But bias generally bespeaks something before a discussion rather than after. So I come with preconceived notions and convictions that aren't warranted in the discussion context.
So let's talk about how bias relates to our fallen nature. Do you think that bias is just part of what it means to be a human being? Or is it something that sort of stems from our fallen nature itself? And then if so, how do you see bias manifesting in everyday life, especially in our judgments of other people?
So I think both. And let's start with just being a human creature. When we have biases, we can't come to most questions without any preconceived notions. So we already have a certain sense of what is consonant with the truths which we already know, even if we haven't rigorously thought through this particular question in all of its dimensions. Our life experience affords us a certain pastiche of experiences, ideas, questions, and conclusions. And when we come to a new question, we can kind of intuit, okay, this doesn't quite fit with what I know on a broader scale in my past is true. So in some level, having a certain bias, if by that we mean just that I have a feeling as I approach a new question of what probably this would kind of knowledge this would lead to, then that's natural. However, what often happens is that biases they don't originate from purely cognitive, rational, logical origin. There's a lot of affective feeling and desire motivations. So it's one thing to have a preconceived notion or a hypothesis or a theory at the beginning in light of ideas and things that I've already been persuaded of. But if I already have, I don't want this conclusion to be true because that would prevent me from doing what I want to do or maintaining what I want to affirm. So to summarize, I would say that biases are natural in the sense that we all have some understanding of the things we're talking about, even before we begin to enter into a robust and comprehensive exchange or debate. But it can become complicated because we sometimes don't want certain things to be true. And so rather than have a legitimate exchange, my desires, my will, my emotions say, I want this to be the conclusion. And then my intellect begins to serve the emotions or the will rather than identify for the emotions and the will what the truth is.
I mean, the way that you're describing bias, it seems like, why would anyone want that? Right? It sounds obviously like a bad thing. Like you want to seek the truth no matter what. So my next question is just like, why are we so drawn to it if it just seems so obviously not the correct thing to do? Like, in especially areas in politics and especially in religion, like that's a lot what we talk about on Capturing Christianity. Why are we so prone to bias in these areas? Because
we intuit that ideas have consequences and we're invested in some consequences more than others. So for example, if we believe that Jesus Christ is Lord of the whole universe and he's our savior, that truth has consequences for my life, which means money cannot be my ultimate end, or power or pleasure can't be my ultimate end, but Jesus, because that's true if he is truly the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the Savior of my soul. On one level, it's very clear we shouldn't have biases, but no human person exists in a vacuum. We like certain things. Some of us, we like power, we like pleasure, we like having Sundays off, not having to go to church. And so the reason why biases come with part of the complexity of being human is that no one is a pure brain or a disincarnate intellect. We have a holistic human experience of ideas, thoughts, yes, but also feelings, emotions, habits, preferences, relationships, connections, ambitions, and biases emerge out of the confluence of all of those things and our desire to have some of those things persist even after the debate. So, for example, if I were, let's say I weren't a Catholic priest and I didn't believe Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, which he truly is, but let's say I didn't believe that, didn't want to believe that, I might argue against the existence of the divinity of Jesus simply because I'd recognize that if I conclude in my mind that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, my whole life would have to change, and I don't want my whole life to change. And in the matter of politics, it's supremely unsurprising that biases can come because the purpose of politics is to effect change, to promote the common good. And so you get different groups with different conceptions of the common good. And so they preeminently want their vision of the common good in society to triumph. And so no one comes preeminently to a political question without already having some biases and preconceptions. So if I had to say, I mean, we can't do this. Politics is a good thing. It's not evil. It often has connotations that are negative. But this is where we need not just politics is in the practice of shaking hands and meeting and writing up bills and things, but we also need political philosophy, which is the exercise of human reason to think through what is society, what is the human person, what is the role of government, what is the common good. We need in the background of any exchange and debate to have the theoretical, the rational, the logical clarified before us before we engage in the practice of politics. So if I had to say it another way, I would say the truth about political order precedes the attempted execution of political order. But in a political debate, the execution is what we're really about. That's what we're trying to garner votes. We're trying to get people on our side. And so at times, the theoretical, the truth of political order can be pushed to the side because we really want X, Y, or Z changes to occur. So one thing you said that's really stuck out to me in the first part of your response was that we're almost like hyper-focused on consequences. So how do you relate
well, in your words, what is the difference between like really seeking after good or trying to avoid maybe negative consequences? Should we aim to do that, or should we aim to just be like a virtuous person? What are your thoughts?
So that's good. I would say virtue is the supreme good for the human person in terms of the fulfillment of what we're all about within our very being. And so what can happen if consequences emerge as the exclusive good? It's like, the only thing that matters is X, Y, or Z happening. If that's the case, then ironically, we end up contradicting the purpose of outcomes, because outcomes are only useful and good if they help other people and human society. So in other words, consequences per se are not an end. They're always connected to and conjoined to human needs and human flourishing. And so to pursue like a consequentialism where the effects are always the most important things, where the end justifies the means in every situation, that can in the end contradict the very purpose of consequences, because consequences are only good if they help us. So with virtue, as you've already intimated in your very perspicacious question, virtue enables us to have both, because the definition of virtue, according to even a pagan like Aristotle, was that virtue is something that which makes both the person, the actor, and his or her actions both good. I'm not virtuous if I just do occasionally good things, but I'm not good. And conversely, I'm not virtuous if I am good in my being, but I never act well or for the good. So virtue is wonderful because it contains within its very notion both the perfection of human persons, their flourishing, how humans can relate, what's good for them, what's harmful for them, and their actions which do lead to consequences. But in our modern age, we kind of separate that. We just think we forget about persons, ironically, often for the sake of consequences. And we need both in order to flourish. Human action, human consequences are important, but human beings are also important. Why? Because human beings are the ones who act and for whom the consequences redound or not.
So do you think that we would see less bias in the media and just in general if people cared, I guess, less about consequences and more about maintaining a virtuous character? Not just in like, kind of like you said, it's not just a virtuous disposition that's important. It's also, it's having a disposition and then also exemplifying those virtues in the world. So do you think that we would see less bias if people like cared about being about both of those things?
I think so. For certainly, I think if we truly, all of us, whether you're on the right or on the left, whether you're religious or not, in the traditional sense of the term, the customary sense of the term, if we cared both about persons and actions, the world would be a better place. But if I could say one thing to people in the public sphere, it would be this. I would say, let's just be more open about our biases. I think that would actually facilitate greater discourse. Like, okay, this is my political party. This is my platform. That's your political party. That's your platform. Here's what I ultimately want. And now I'm going to explain to you both why that's a good thing to want and why you not wanting that is not good. And then the steps I propose to get there. Basically, I think that if we, as complex human persons, were more overt, open, and transparent about our biases and about the inner workings of how the biases affect everything, we could actually facilitate greater conversation with people. It's because of things that are not said or things that are presupposed or overt or covert, rather, motivations in debates or exchanges that confusion can occur. And so it would be great if we just had people that said, I want this, and that's why I'm going to argue in this way. Okay, we know where you're coming from. We know where you're going. We could have a real discussion there.
So openness, I think, is a really great quality to have. But I think some people just don't even recognize that they're biased in certain ways. So how would you, what are some sort of practical tips to help us see whether or not we actually are biased in a situation or in an argument?
So good. It's good practical tips. So I would say, first of all, we have to maintain a certain serenity with regard to our emotions and our desires. And this applies both to the right and to the left, to Christians, to to everyone. If we hold truths as supremely important for us personally They matter a lot. And sometimes when I'm discussing ideas or truth claims with someone who doesn't share my convictions and they're critiquing my convictions, whether validly or invalidly, I can begin to have an emotional response, and that doesn't actually facilitate sound thinking. But the second thing I would say, in addition to keeping kind of emotions, recognizing that it's okay to feel deeply, but that the proper engagement in a discussion or debate is rational. The other thing, I need to think through all of the ways in which my position, my convictions, all the implications that they carry for other things. So in other words, ironically, what often happens even in political, scientific, natural sphere is conclusions or convictions, biases that we bring that almost are like articles of faith. Well, we all know that, marriage should be for anybody, or we all know that marriage should be just for men and women. But no one wants to ask why. We should be interested in discussions to get back to the presuppositions and the first principles that we bring to a debate. Again, coming back to a kind of an overt consciousness of what our biases are and think through them. Because otherwise, if it's just, I don't want to think about why I think the way I think, then it becomes basically acts of violence where now I just, through raising my voice or shaming you or making fun of you, or I'm using my position to bowl you over rather than to persuade. This is the great truth that St. Thomas Aquinas and then Aristotle both showed, is that the truth is never violent. The truth unites. Because let's say there's a truth, 2 + 2 = 4. You, Cameron, and I both can come before that truth, 2 + 2 = 4, and your mind can be conformed to that and possess that truth. My mind can also recognize and possess that truth. And there's no violence because the truth of reality unites us. We meet there. If we believe that there's such a thing as true truth, then we have a real place in which human minds and human society can truly be united. If, however, we don't believe that there's such a thing as truth, that there's no reality out there in which we can all be united, then it's just what you come up with and what I come up with, and we're constantly throwing our own realities at each other. And so I think that is something that's often not recognized in contemporary discussions, and that is the fact that the truth always unites, because the truth is ultimately the conformity of the mind, the soul with reality. And reality is real enough, big enough to sustain both you and I and the whole world together.
So my next question is about Christianity in general. Like, does Christianity have any sort of upper hand, maybe, or like any sort of intellectual resources that can help us overcome bias in a way that maybe non-Christians they don't really have access to those resources? Is there anything unique to Christianity that can help us here?
One of the things that is intricate and essential to Christianity is that truth is bigger than we are, because Christianity is built upon the articles of the Creed. I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, etc., etc., etc. And Christianity is founded upon the fact that God in his goodness has revealed to us, rational, fallen, finite creatures, truths which we would never be able to discover by ourselves or make by ourselves. Without faith and supernatural truths graciously revealed to us by a loving God, there is no Christianity. So when, as a Christian, then we come with that passive disposition, that passive posture of having received truths which are bigger from us. And so the advantage for that, of that posture of passivity, is a Christian never enters a debate thinking that truth depends upon them, or that truth is contingent upon them, or that truth is a product of them, because we know that the highest truths, we didn't make them, discover them, create them. They were revealed to us by divine revelation, and we receive them in faith. And so therefore, when I and you and others come into discussions, we bear within us this posture of openness, because we know that truth starts from outside of us, but is truly proportioned to us. It's bigger than we are, but we can participate in it. It exceeds our comprehension and exhaustion, but it's not completely inaccessible to our understanding and contemplation. And therefore, if you and I are having a discussion with this posture of, yeah, truth is bigger than us, but we can know it, you and I ironically have a dual humility and a confidence. We have a humility because I know and you know that the end of this discussion is truth. And truth isn't something you and I make. It's something we discover. So there's a humility there. We're in a journey together to discover what reality is. So there's a humility because we know truth is bigger than us, but we can truly participate in it together. Secondly, there's a confidence because truth is truly knowable. There is something out there. Reality is intelligible. And therefore, we know that even if you and I spend hours or days or weeks discussing a problem that still our minds can't get quite wrapped around, we have confidence that there is the truth. The truth is possible to know because it doesn't depend upon us or our efforts ultimately to exist. So there's that dual element that the very posture of the Christian that receives truth, the highest truths, the truths of faith from God, to be a Christian, then you know, okay, truth doesn't depend upon me, certainly not the highest truths. And then when I come to other truths, the truths of politics or the truths of philosophy or science, I'm both humbled and in awe of the fact that, wow, there is real society, politics. There is real being, philosophy. There is real natural phenomena, science. And it's bigger than me. And even though I'm not the master of it, I don't make the natural world or being, but I can understand it. And reality in its density, its content invites kind of a humble yet confident engagement with it. To put it a little more pointedly, I think the great problem today is that many of us think truth is the product of human creativity and human ingenuity. And that's why we have so many complexities when it comes to trying to find truth. Because if truth is something you make, Cameron, or something I make, then for you to accept my truth means you have to accept me, which means you have to submit to me, which means I have to dominate you. That's a modern understanding of truth. The classical understanding of truth is, no, truth is not about me. It's not about you. It's bigger than both of us. And therefore, there is no violence. There is no threat. There is no competition because it's ultimately about two or more human persons trying to know the way things are in a reality which exceeds their natural comprehension.
Do you believe that there's a sort of spiritual dimension to all of this? Like, is there a spiritual dimension to bias?
There is. And so this is one of my favorite things to say is there is no such thing as a non-intellectual spirituality. And conversely, all intellectual ideas are spiritual and have spiritual implications. What do I mean by that? I mean that your intellect is within the power of your soul, which is your spirit. Therefore, when the mind understands something, when the mind reflects, when the mind knows reality, literally your soul, your spirit is moved towards that thing that you know. This is why we hear, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Therefore, our ideas, our spiritual conceptions of things, those do have a profound implication for the spiritual life. This is the great thing today. Everyone likes to say they're spiritual but not religious, but in the end, it's impossible to be spiritual without religious because we're human persons of body and soul. But everyone's spirituality is deeply connected to their ideas. And this is why, again, the truth liberates. Only the truth sets us free because only the truth gives the soul, our spirit, that contact with reality and enables, therefore, the human person, because of the soul's contact with reality, to live in an ordered way in reality. I think you're suggesting, very insightfully as usual, spiritual disorder will affect the ability to understand the truth. So let's just imagine if I hate everybody and I hate society and I think stealing is wonderful and I think unchastity is great and I think that lying is an ordinary form of discourse and that's what should be the norm. Those are all impossible. But if I really think that spirituality, those disorders, those confusions in my soul are going to affect how I think and how I relate to other people and how I watch read books, engage people, because those erroneous convictions are going to shape how I hear everything else. So yes, I would say for our listeners and our friends, the key verse to keep in mind, which is true and evidently true, even if you're not Christian, is, as a man thinketh in his heart, or a woman thinketh in her heart, so is he or she. Because where the mind goes, the human person goes. And if the mind is disordered, human life will also suffer disorder, because the mind is the way through which we live. Our consciousness, our awareness, our rationality leads our human existence.
All right, so to sort of wrap up the interview, my last question for you has to do with how to discern truth in today's atmosphere, especially when it comes to watching these sort of political debates, and not just political debates. I mean, on my channel, we host a lot of religious discussions between Christians and non-Christians and stuff. So what advice do you have for Christians that are sort of navigating media consumption?
So that's a very difficult question, because media consumption is wonderful, and it's also a liability. And for the same reason, it's wonderful because new ideas, new conversations, new discussions are immediately accessible. You can scroll through YouTube and find 1,000 interesting and insightful and stimulating conversations. That's why it's wonderful. Media is also is a liability, because the human mind has to process things deliberately and carefully. And so the alacrity of media consumption prevents at times the human mind, us as listeners and thinkers, from really following and learning to be careful and precise in how we parse positions, nuanced distinctions. So I would say, I would counsel listeners or viewers to slow both their thinking and the pace with which they view things. It is possible for the human mind to be overloaded with content. And what we ought to do to think clearly, we ought to be able to look at a position, to hear a speech, whether it's political or not, to read a book chapter or an article, and be able to identify what is the core conclusion here, and then spend time with that, thinking about its presuppositions and its implications. Too often, we just consume media talking heads and ideas without really processing them. And that's a disadvantage to both the speaker and to us ourselves, because we never really grasp or comprehend formally as truth what they're saying. So the most practical thing is, of course, no one should stop watching your show, Cameron. That's the first thing. But every other channel, slow down, think carefully, precisely, and deliberately. Try to identify what is the core point of this speech, and then pause for a moment and reflect. Basically, without it, no one will be saved through data alone. Information alone does not save. What saves is when a few precious, foundational, significant truths, not 1,000 insignificant details, but a few precious and significant foundational truths the human mind really understands and has grasped and wrestles with and sees how they're at the center of all derivative truths. We kind of want to collect the 1,000, but we miss the power of the 3, the 4, the 5, the key truths. So
I'm going to have one more question for you, and it has to do with rhetoric. I know that even when I was watching the debate, like you notice, especially with politicians, I mean, it happens with politicians all the time, where they'll be asked a question. It happened on both sides, and then they don't answer. Like they answer some other unrelated question. They just sort of filibuster and then move to their own talking points. And what I think that is it's just pure rhetoric, right? They're avoiding answering the question directly, and they're talking about something sort of unrelated. But then nevertheless, like, it's a really good strategy, because you avoid answering this tough question, and then you can also persuade voters or persuade people, persuade the minds of those that are watching toward your position. And so, but it nevertheless, I think, is a form of rhetoric. So how can we avoid sort of being duped by rhetoric? And I think it is sort of all related to the question of bias.
So rhetoric, and we're talking about rhetoric in its well-executed use. Rhetoric is meant to serve the discovery or the comprehension of truth. So we've all had in high school teachers of mathematics or science or English who not only knew their subject, but we're able to explain it in a way that facilitated our coming to know that subject as well. We've also had professors that we know their subjects, but have difficulty articulating and explaining and presenting it in a way that we can, as listeners, as students, receive. That facility with explaining it in a way that's easy, pleasant, joyful for the listener to follow, that's rhetoric. And rhetoric is good if rhetoric is ordered towards helping us understand what the point or what the truth really is. If, on the other hand, rhetoric subsists, is kind of separated from the truth or from a point, and just becomes colorful speech that floats around the atmosphere, then it is profoundly disordered and indeed vicious in the sense of vice, non-perfective. And this is the great problem with the philosophers of the pre-Socratic period that were known as the sophists. They didn't care about any position. They were trained simply to use flowery words, good examples, images that would stir up their listeners. Mm-hmm. But if in the end you ask them, well, what is the point? They say, well, I don't really know and I don't really care. And so in order to avoid that, as you listen to great rhetoricians, and we've had them in the last, 20 years, 30 years throughout the history of the country, we've had wonderfully gifted orators, rhetoricians, the guys, presidents, politicians who can explain things in a way that is pleasantly and easily understood and followed. So that's wonderful. If, however, as we're listening to someone explain something, and either we don't see a point, even though it's pleasant to listen to, or that point is actually deceptive, or that point is not true, that's when we should have at least a yellow light, if not a red light, say, okay, something's gone wrong here. These are words without a point. Good rhetoric. I think all of us should study rhetoric. It's a wonderful thing, but in service to truth and reality. If rhetoric becomes the end, it's like nutritionless food. It tastes great, but in the end, what did we get from it? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. That's highly disordered. It's highly imperfective. What we should have, and I assume you have an Italian background, so you know this preeminently, food should be both nutritious and delicious. Food should have content, delight for the palate, as well as nutrition for the body. Likewise, a speech should be able to communicate truth and information clearly and effectively, but also be pleasant to listen to.
Yeah, this is all too relevant for me because I've been on a diet the last couple months and I've lost 20 pounds. So I'm actually about to release an interview with the person who's been helping me get to this point. And it's been like life-changing, like literally life-changing. It's the most incredible decision that I've ever made. I originally did it to help this person out. And then it ended up helping me way, way more. And so it's interesting that you made that connection there. But Father Cuddy, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with on this topic? Anything that we maybe haven't covered that we should have covered? Any last thoughts?
The last thing I would say in a 45-second conclusion would just be only the truth has grace. There's no such thing as a loving lie. The truth is perfective of the human person. Every person desires the truth. Truth is immanently and intrinsically unitive. So we should not fear the truth. We should not fear or be afraid that the truth is a weapon. But nor should we be sheepish or pusillanimous, wimpy before it, because the truth is what we're made for. So live with gusto, with a humble confidence that the truth sets us free. There is no such thing as a loving lie. Every truth is loving or is ordered to the union of love. And therefore, no one should ever shy away from thinking clearly, carefully, and rigorously about all things.